Have you taken control of your financial education? It is up to you to have the accountability and building up their knowledge base when it comes to the financial literacy. And in today's video, it is the entire week's compilation of videos such as 5 ways to double your money, ways to save money, your IRA conversions, and also looking at the investment side. So I hope you enjoy it. Have you ever considered how your parents or your grandparents viewed finances? That's exactly what we're going to be looking at in today's video, is looking at past generations and things that they did very well when it came to finances. And let me know in the comments, guys, what you did or what you've seen your parents do when it comes to finances. So starting with our first one, saving before they spend. Now, this is kind of something that faded off and really disappeared in the 90s when credit card debt and really financing became such a popular, really topic and such a popular way to buy things. Traditionally, when we look at our parents' generation, if you wanted something, you saved for it, and that was it. If you wanted to go out, if you had plans, if you were going on vacation, you would save the money and then actually purchase the item or do whatever event, whatever you were saving for. And that meant that when you did it that way, you stayed out of the debt cycle. You didn't have to pay, $5,000 for a trip. It would be a cost of $5,000. It wouldn't be the $5,000 plus the 3 to 5 years that you're financing that, paying $7,000, $8,000, saving you probably hundreds of thousands. And even when you start looking back at previous generations, looking at cars, looking at homes, new appliances, they were paid with cash or financed for a very, very short term. Even when they started doing mortgages, the maximum mortgage term was 2 years. That's right, you could only finance a house for a total of 2 years, setting aside money and really saving until they could afford to do whatever they need to, which I know we can take a page from the playbook and look at this and being able to save for some of the things that we want to get. And what does it take and how long is it going to take to save for whatever you're looking for? Now, the second one, they took time to make decisions. This is one that we really stress when it comes to financial education and when it comes to counseling, is if you're looking at the latest gadget, if you're looking to upgrade your lifestyle, just because, is it trendy? Do you need it? Is it something that is going to serve a purpose? Is it something that's going to be an asset? They really put a lot more, in my opinion, value around money versus the instant gratification that we see, and really looking at the buyer's remorse and also unnecessary expenses that we see in the budgeting today that essentially can be set aside to a later date. And when we look at the third one, they planned for emergencies. The emergency fund isn't something that we thought up, a couple weeks or a couple months ago. The emergency fund dates way, way back to when people would actually save money for emergencies. They understood that life was going to throw a curveball. There is going to be a point, and I can guarantee you, even today, if you're not financially prepared and with an emergency fund, a financial difficulty, a hardship, a job loss, anything can really set you back, and it can derail your finances in the entirety. Being in the financial institutions for almost 17 years now, I have seen where people don't have $500 to $1,000 for an unexpected emergency. All of a sudden, an unexpected emergency happens. They're looking at expensive loans, doing short-term lending, looking at cash advance places, or just throwing it all on the credit card, which we know has a very, very big interest rate. And number 4, they bought only what they could afford. This sounds super simple, but guess what people do not do? Living with inside of their means. The golden rule always said, if you can't afford it, don't buy it. Now there was no buy now, pay later like we're seeing today, where if you don't have the money today, you can buy it, you can spread it out by 4 payments, 6 payments, 8 payments, 12 payments. Regardless of what it is, they waited until they had money on hand to make a purchase. And of course, that came at a much cheaper cost, not only to avoid debt, but to be financially secure, because with the same approach, you're staying away from high interest credit cards, you're staying away from loans, and you're also not really robbing the money that future you would have. If I'm doing a payday advance right now, or I'm doing something where it's a buy now, pay later, if I'm looking at the next 6 to 12 months, I don't know what is going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months. If I'm already borrowing money that I have not earned, if I lose a job, if there's an emergency, anything happens, I am now adding additional liabilities into that big bucket, meaning that it could be more difficult to keep my finances together, quite frankly, if something should happen. Now, number 5, they focused on longevity. Instead of buying cheap throwaway items, which we know when you think of a dollar store, when you think of everything imported from a lot of things from China in different countries, it is just really a throwaway item where you might use it once, you might use it twice, and then it is garbage. When we start looking at furniture, clothing, home appliances, Most people are willing to spend a little bit more to get a better quality. And that's where my big trigger came in probably about 10 years ago with frugality. When you start thinking of frugal, the cheapest option might not be the best option, but knowing what is the best or highest quality, even though it might be a little bit more expensive, can save you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars when it comes to having to replace those items. Now, number 6, knowing the value of patience. This is kind of crazy. It is, and really we live in a world where instant gratification is exactly what everyone wants. Past generations didn't chase those instant rewards. They knew that waiting until the right time, saving up, making the thoughtful decision would benefit in the long term, and they'd actually find a lot more appreciation by doing it that way. In the world, again, of the instant options, practicing patience can be the difference between having financial freedom, being weighed down by debt, and also being able to say that you live the debt-free journey kind of life that I love to live. Number 7, they shared and borrowed instead of buying. This is kind of crazy. So this is something when we start talking about communities, when we start talking about families, if you needed a tool, you would go to your neighbor, you would borrow it. If you needed something like a special event, communities came together. And this, I know back in the day, once upon a time, whatever you want to say, it wasn't really in a rush to buy the new things or even the utilization where you might buy something and only use it once. I know years ago, I was guilty of this. I would buy something for a job or a project, regardless if it was plumbing, if it was home repair, anything. I would buy something, I would use it usually one time to do whatever job I needed to. Then there was no more and really not a need for it. Now I've partnered with all of the neighborhood dads getting together and making sure that there's a lot of things that we can cover, even looking at lawn spreaders, even looking at small things, of course, that you might not need right now, but using it maybe a day or two, renting it, borrowing it, sharing it with your friends and your family, you can really come together, and this can save you actually an incredible amount of money. Number 8, the practice, use it up and wear it out. Now, this is an old term that I had not heard of. So grandparents used to say, use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. Guys, imagine if you told your children in this day and age, this generation that we have right here, if something was still functional, it didn't get replaced, you squeezed every little last bit of use out of everything that they had, whether it was a piece of clothing, an appliance, even a car, making it and really repairing it versus replacing and upgrading. Now we're in the really recycling world where we recycle and really discount and get rid of everything in a very, very short window, really negating almost any utility that some of these products and services do have. Number 9, regular maintenance to avoid costly repairs. Now, this is something that I have understood and I do on a regular basis. And you know what? It has probably saved me tens of thousands of dollars. So what we mean by this, major appliances, it is cheaper to repair for a majority of them than just replacing. But when you start thinking of vehicles, when you start thinking of the maintenance on your cars, the maintenance on your home, even thinking of just a quick check, that I think about when we do is getting regular oil changes, getting your tires checked, looking at your windows, your doors in your home, having your furnace and your HVAC serviced. When's the last time you did this? And honestly, when you start looking at this, you can avoid a majority of the costly repairs that, of course, you're going to wait 5 to 10 years. All of a sudden your furnace goes out because it hasn't been maintained in 5 and 10 years. Now you're hit with sticker shock with a major big price tag to replace that unit, where if you just spent a couple $100 every single year, might have lasted 5 or 10 years longer. And of course, when it's time to upgrade, you can upgrade it. You can go ahead and do that because you have been budgeting and really maintaining it properly. By budgeting, you can save for a home. If you're a homeowner, guys, it has to be built in the budget. $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever it's going to be. There are going to be repairs that are coming in your home, whether it's a furnace, an HVAC, windows, roof. There are so many things as a homeowner that people do not set aside in budget. Then, of course, when the big price tag comes in, they come in to borrow $20,000 to do home repairs. That $20,000 with interest is now $30,000, and they wonder where their monthly budget and where their payments are really going. People, you got to understand that borrowing money comes with a big price tag, and the interest you have to pay does come with a big price tag as well. Looking at number 10, cooking in batches and storing for later. This is something I know that a lot of people used to do. We have actually started doing this as well. We have started meal prepping. Makes a big difference on the budget. Now, what we mean by that is on a Sunday, we might make 3 or 5 recipes, having all of the stuff that we need to provide and build and create those 3 to 5 recipes, meaning that we don't have to do it all week in busy lives. You can kind of meal prep. This also keeps us from impulse buying when we go shopping. We know exactly on a checklist exactly what we need to get for the week. That way we have enough to make all of the meal prep, and also kind of minimizing the food waste. It is estimated that 30 to 40% of food, which we know right now is crazy expensive, is thrown away in waste. Keeps us from getting takeout, keeps us from the spontaneous grocery trips where we do need or forgot some items, or the impulse buying, which of course is super expensive. And number 11, choosing quality over quantity. This of course is something, like I said earlier, when it comes to the frugality that has been built in me, and I'm building it right into my kids. Rather than filling a home with cheap, trendy items that are just dollar store garbage, past generations invested in a few well-made things that actually had value that could be passed down and really utilized and used over decades. This includes furniture, clothing. Investing in quality over quantity is frugality. Again, a lot of people think when you really say the word frugal, and when you think of frugal, a lot of people think of cheap. But it is not so much being cheap. It is about items that have quality that you don't have to repair or replace on a regular basis. This can save you thousands of dollars. And we've talked about it before. When it even comes to a basic wardrobe, getting all of your basics covered with high quality items might be a little bit more expensive up front, but in the long term, it is going to save you a lot of money. Number 12, don't outsource what you could do yourself. With technology, with YouTube, and of course, if you like the content I'm putting out, please subscribe to the channel. But when it comes to YouTube and when it comes to DIY, doing it yourself, everyday tasks are super easy because I don't know anything. And personally, if you have found anything, I have not seen anything that I cannot find a YouTube video on, literally from the basics of changing a light bulb to the complex of replacing my Bowflex or repairing my Bowflex in the basement, which I did successfully. Thank you for the YouTube videos out there. Even honestly, making gifts, making decorations, homemade things. There are so many things that are DIY mentality. If you really go in there and have a sense of pride, self-sufficiency, you can repair a lot of things versus having it serviced or just simply replacing that item that you do. And the final one, which is the biggest one that I always see, we save the biggest one for last, keeping up with the Joneses. When it comes to keeping up with the Joneses, past generations really didn't have the presence of what the neighbors are doing, what the families are doing. This is, of course, coming with the big rise on social media. Focus on really financial goals and knowing what their household looks like instead of comparing it to others. When you think of social media in general, it is really the best of the best, or the best version of people. You might see a new car, you might see, something that your neighbor's got that you don't have, but you don't know their financial situation. They might be financing that car for 10 years or 7 years, 8 years. That's the only way they can afford it because they're very strapped for cash, or they're even underwater by taking on additional debt. You do not know it. The ability to keep up really just means keeping up with debt. For a majority of people, just really getting to the peace of mind and knowing the understanding of what you want to do, what your financial goals look like, regardless of anyone else's financial goals, will really be a game changer. When you start looking at past generations, delayed gratification can save you thousands. Slowing down, making more intentional and better decisions, focusing on what truly matters, regardless again of what other people do, because you don't know their financial situations. All right, guys, so those are some things that past generations did incredibly well that you could go ahead and apply to your life, saving you thousands of dollars. But let me know in the comments what you guys think, and I'll catch you in the next video. As you get closer to retirement, have you ever considered moving some of your traditional IRA or 401k money into the Roth variation? Today's video, we're going to be looking at the pros and cons of it. This is a question that was posed to me a little bit earlier today. What is the advantages and the disadvantages of a Roth conversion? So when you have a traditional 401k or a traditional IRA, you do have the ability to essentially take that money and convert it into a Roth variation, but you will be required to pay the tax bill. Very important to understand with this conversion, you are transferring retirement funds from a tax deferred account into a tax deductible or a tax already paid account, which is the Roth variation. Now, when it comes to investing, when it comes to finance in general, I always recommend doing the Roth version, because when you start looking at the future growth, if you're a younger generation, if you're in your 20s and 30s, if you're doing the Roth and paying the taxes now, chances are when you fast forward 40 years down the road, the growth alone is going to be able to cover the taxes. But let's get into this. So first of all, we're going to look at the advantages of the Roth conversion. So this again is taking money that is in that 401k or that traditional IRA and transferring it or converting it into the Roth. Now, the first one, which is the biggest one, anticipating a higher tax bracket in later retirement years. This, of course, for a lot of individuals is very dependent on how much you have. It's a little bit different if when you're getting to retirement and you have $100,000, $150,000, when you start looking at those tax brackets, what your required minimum distribution or RMDs are going to be can make a big difference. Then when you couple it with Social Security, again, this can make a big difference when you start having those mandatory withdrawals. That can put you into a higher tax bracket. A Roth conversion during the early years, essentially the gap or the spread between when you stop working and when you start drawing Social Security, you will be at your absolute lowest point. And that could be a good point to actually take and do some of the conversion, allowing you to convert it at a much lower tax bracket and usually at a much lower rate than you normally would do. Now, this, of course, could save you money in the long run. And it also, again, makes a difference on how much you have in these accounts, because when you start looking at the progressive tax system, there's a point where you're going to pay the same amount over a dollar amount, depending on exactly what you're converting. For instance, if you're converting, let's say $100,000, and you're in the 25% tax bracket and it all falls in there, you're going to have to pay 25% or $25,000 of that towards the tax bill for the year that it's converted, making sure that you have that money set aside, because if you're taking it out of the retirement funds, not only are you going to have that extra $25,000 that is from the retirement funds for the conversion, but you'll also have to pay the tax that is required on that as well. Now, the second one, the need for tax diversification in the income plan. Now, this is something that I look. So when you think of what your tax rate is going to be, it can be incredibly difficult because we don't know what the government's going to do. We don't know what the tax rate is going to be in the future, which of course gives you a little diversification, meaning that if you do have a considerable amount of funds in a traditional account, you can even maybe not convert all of it to a Roth variation, but you can really convert some of it, knowing that the tax status could change in the future. And also remember, when it comes to Social Security and drawing Social Security, that is meant to replace roughly 40% of your income, which traditionally, just speaking in a general term, roughly replacing 85% of your income in retirement is what we normally see. You might not be, replacing 100% of those pre-retirement dollars, but you are replacing roughly 85% of your pre-retirement income when it comes to Social Security. So mathematically thinking about that, you have a pretty big chunk that you have to make up that is not going to be provided from Social Security. So there is going to be a point where it might make sense to leave some of the money that we have in here as the traditional that you're going to take the RMD. That is going to be the supplement to Social Security. That is going to be the money you're going to live on during those retirement years. Now, again, converting a portion of that to the Roth variant means that you have already paid the taxes. You're not required to take RMDs or required minimum distributions on that, and you can let that money grow tax-free. That can be kind of the backup that you've already paid taxes on when you get there. Now, of course, when you think of this, the current tax situation, really optimizing your overall tax liability and how much you're going to owe. If you're getting into retirement and you have $3 to $5 million in a traditional plan, the RMDs on there are going to be huge. When you start getting to retirement, there is actually a multiplication factor that you can look at the IRS and see what the RMDs are going to be when you get into these much larger tax accounts. That could be, again, a big reason for the conversion. Now, the last one for the advantages in here, benefiting high income heirs with tax efficient inheritance. That's right. If you're an heir or if you're transferring money into or giving it to someone else at a higher tax bracket, leaving them a Roth IRA means they are inheriting this wealth tax-free. That's right. The money has already been paid in there, meaning that for me personally, I have a small portion of my income or my retirement planning that is set up in the traditional method. I have a big chunk of it or a majority of it that is set up in the Roth. Between Social Security, between what we have saved, between what we have in our traditional accounts, the Roth money is essentially going to be what is going to go to the heirs, which of course can have a very significant benefit. When you want to pass on considerable estate or assets to other individuals, it can make a big difference because again, you've already paid the tax on this and it is growing tax-free. Now, you also have to remember when it comes to these conversions, when it comes to retirement funds in general, when you retire at 65, 68, 70, when you start drawing Social Security, that is not the point when you're going to die, when you're going to use all the money, where you're going to have access to everything. That is the point where you're going to start living that retirement life. And with that, you're going to be taking regular distributions, but you still need your money to grow. This is something that I've really stressed with a lot of individuals. I see them getting to retirement. They pull out all of that 401k money. They park it into an IRA account at a bank or a credit union. It grows at a 0.3%, and they just really churn and take a lot of money out of there, way over the 4%, which is recommended. But overall, depending on what you need to supplement your income, what kind of retirement you want, what kind of lifestyle you want to have during retirement, it's going to make a big difference on how much you're taking out of there. Now, of course, when it comes to the Roth conversions, there is also drawbacks. It is not all positive. It is not all really, just everything convert to a Roth. When you think of some of the tax brackets, being in a higher tax bracket right now versus later. So a lot of people right now during working, if you have one income, if you have two incomes, if you have a part-time side hustle like we have here on YouTube, and of course, if you like the content I'm putting out, definitely subscribe to the channel. But when you think of having multiple sources of income, really generating a lot more income right now means that my tax bracket could be significantly higher than we're going to see during those retirement years. And like I said before, when you have the little valley where you quit working and really lower your income, and then the point when you start getting Social Security, you can do quite a bit of a conversion in there. But of course, if I'm paying, 25, 28% right now, during retirement, I could be paying 15% as supplementing, which of course would not be beneficial, short of where the growth factor could come in, but it would make a big difference. Now, the second one, upfront tax payments. This is the significant drawback, and this is the big one. When you do the conversion, you have an immediate tax liability when you do the conversion. And of course, requiring to pay these might tap into savings, might tap into other investment accounts, and it can negate the long-term benefit of the conversion if you're drawing money from other places. Now, for me, I have done Roth conversions in the past. So we took $50,000 that was traditional money. We moved it into a Roth, and we did this at $10,000 a year. And at that $10,000 a year, we were just under the tax bracket that we wanted to be at a roughly 22%. But moving $50,000 from a traditional account into the tax-free account has grown exponentially, and all of the money that we have grown in there, which at this point is well over doubled, it is completely tax-free. Again, that is money that is earmarked for my kids, for my grandkids, that we're not going to be using that Roth variation for. Now, the final one in here, conflicting with charitable giving strategies. So for those very high income earners, for those planning significant charity donations through the QCD, qualified charitable distribution, Roth conversions might not be ideal. Definitely check with your tax advisor, but it allows for tax efficiency when you're giving money to charities and going directly from a traditional IRA. You could lose some of the benefits if you are converting this to a Roth, making a big decision. Now, of course, when it comes to these in the conversion, always talk to a tax advisor. If you're not willing to put in the time and the effort and understanding exactly what a conversion could mean for you. And overall, like I said, even thinking of a younger generation, putting money into the Roth variation does make a really big difference. You don't get the upfront tax benefit now, but when you start looking at 20, 30, 40 years down the road, the benefit and the growth that you're going to see in that time frame is going to far eclipse what you get from a traditional account. Personally, that's the reason why when it comes to a 401k like me, I put everything into a Roth 401k. I do have the option, if I'm making contributions into an IRA, I only do an IRA that is invested in its entirety. I have links down below from M1 Finance. That is where I have my Roth IRA that is invested in the market. It is the only way that I recommend it. You have to have the money in the market. You have to have the money that has the ability to grow. You don't want it sitting there. You don't want it essentially not earning anything or not multiplying the wealth to really create it. All right, guys, so that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Saving money is super important. Money in a savings account really safeguards you against unexpected expenses expenses or that emergency fund and hardship that could happen like job loss. The problem is, are Americans really saving enough money? And in today's video, we're going to be looking at 4 mind-blowing stats on how much money Americans are saving. And I really want to break this down and really get into it. Number one, the average American has $8,000 in savings. Now, when you look at the Money Fool, they are talking about $8,000, not just in savings accounts. This also includes all transactional accounts. We're talking savings accounts, money market, checking accounts, call account, prepaid debit accounts. All of that accumulates to about $8,000 in savings, which we know an emergency fund 3 to 6 months, $8,000 is not going to save it. Now, when you look in comparison to 2019, so just 5 years ago, the average savings was roughly around $6,000. So we're getting a little bit better. We're saving a little bit more money, but it is still not enough to fully fund that emergency fund. Now, looking at expert recommendation of that 3 to 6 months with that emergency fund, most people have $8,000 in their bank accounts at all, which of course, looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2024, the average spending was around $6,000 a month as a nation on average. So when you think about having, $8,000 in there versus the 6,000 people are spending a month, most people are living paycheck to paycheck. And if something happens that you cannot use or don't have a way to replenish the funds in there, of course, it's going to go bad and your finances can go south very quick. In fact, looking at some of this additional research, Americans aren't prepared for surprises, with just 54% of people actually holding 3 months of an emergency fund in a savings or a bank account. And honestly, I'm pretty shocked with the 54%. I thought it would be a little bit higher than that, but overall, having that fully funded emergency fund really does make a difference. Now, remember of the FOO or the financial order of operations, the way that you should actually do this is if you're sitting on a bunch of money in the emergency savings, or if you've saved that 3 to 6 months, some of that money might be better allocated really doing debt repayment, getting rid of some of the credit card debt, freeing up some of that cash flow so you can replenish it as soon as possible. But if you are sitting on 3 to 6 months, let me know in the comments if you're part of that 54%. So the second one, the richest Americans have more than 5 times the savings of the upper middle class. That's right, when you start looking at the top percentile in the United States, which is a medium transaction account balance of $128K. So if you're sitting on $128,000 sitting in your bank, you probably need to be investing it somewhere else. You need to have it somewhere else. And of course, when you look at the upper middle class, their savings balance is about 41K. So again, just a little bit north of having that emergency fund, that 3 to 6 months. And I'm thinking even with the upper middle class, is 41K or $41,000 going to be enough to cover the expenses? If something does happen, chances are probably not. When you start looking at $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 mortgage payments, that money can go away pretty quick. Now, of course, it's very expected that the rich are going to have a little bit more money, but there's a massive gap when you think of the wealthy individuals and the upper middle class. We're not even getting into the middle class or the lower class. There is a big wealth disparity in the United States, and we can see that pretty much anywhere that you look. Now, the third one we look at, almost half of young Americans have a separate emergency fund. This is something as a financial counselor that we have really stressed over and over and over again. You have to have an emergency fund. This is definitely good news when it comes to a younger generation. Both Gen Zers and millennials are taking emergency funds and having that money set aside, far more serious than we ever did with the Gen Z and with the boomers. Within the group, looking at, again, the Gen Zs and the millennials, they have roughly 40% of them have a separate savings account. That is strictly for emergencies. When we talk about the emergency fund, it really, you have to have it separate. You have to have it somewhere else. And the reason is a lot of people intermingle the funds, and then they end up having something that's not a true emergency. Maybe it's something that they see as an emergency or can be really construed as an emergency, but it is not a true emergency. And if you have easy access to the money that you have earmarked for an emergency fund, you can go ahead and borrow that. Now, that, of course, is in comparison with 32% of those Gen Z and the baby boomers having a separate savings account, which is just because of the emergencies. Now, they're really calculating this and really putting this on Gen Zs and millennials, that it is because of what we've seen in 2008 with the Great Recession and the housing market crunch. And then, of course, COVID-19 in 2020. This has prompted a little bit of the younger generation take a little bit more risk or save a little bit more when it comes to the emergency fund if they can. And the fourth one in here, 66% of Americans have their savings in a wrong account. Now, this is something personally that drives me crazy. When we start thinking of money in a savings account, when we start thinking of an emergency fund, where do Americans put their savings? Just in banks, just in traditional savings accounts, just in high or really very high either fee or low interest rates. Now, only 34% of Americans that have emergency funds earn at least an interest rate of 4%. Think about that. 34% of individuals that have money earn less than 4%. So when you think of inflation, if you're parking money in that emergency fund, it is losing money. For me personally, I use M1 Finance, 4.5%. So a little bit over the 4% that you're getting on that emergency fund. Parking the money there makes a big difference. Now, of course, who does not want to earn more money in building up that emergency fund with the high yield savings accounts? Now, of course, these are not going to be around forever, but taking full advantage of it right now, it can make a big difference if you're earning 4.5%, 5%, and growing that balance, even if you have $8,000 on a medium income. Looking at the regular savings rates that we see around the banking institution, they're around a 0.3%. So parking your money at a financial institution might not be the most beneficial, and you could actually be losing money due to inflation. Now, the final one that I want to talk about, and this is something that I see a lot, is when it comes to retirement accounts. We are talking about your IRA accounts. We are talking about on the Roth accounts, the traditional IRA accounts, the accounts that are parked at your Chase, your Bank of America, Wells Fargo, even looking at banks and credit unions. If it is retirement funds and you're not even close to retirement age, do not park them. And I really do stress this. Do not park them in financial institutions that are just going to simply give you the 0.3% that is on an IRA account, because that is what I see a lot of times. And then, of course, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, people are making regular contributions into those accounts, not realizing that they're not seeing the growth, they're not seeing the dividends, they're not seeing the compounding aspect that it needs to be really to grow within the market itself. Even if you put it in bonds, if you put it in the VOO, regardless of where you put it, when you think of retirement funds need to be invested in the market. That is something I see, and I really do educate a lot of people that I do financial counseling and education. It's great to have an IRA. It's great to have, a Roth IRA, which I highly recommend. But that Roth IRA needs to be invested in the market, needs to be able to grow, needs to be able to take a little bit of risk instead of just keeping it very secured and not making really any money at all. When you get to retirement and when you get closer down the road, you will thank me, trust me, tenfold when we start seeing those accounts grow. Even though stock market's up and down, when we think about retirement accounts, we are talking 5 years plus. This isn't going to be the emergency fund you might need in a month or two that you're keeping liquid. This isn't the money that you're setting aside, let's say for a CD, short term in the next 2 to 3 years. We are talking retirement accounts, 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years until retirement. If you're putting regular contributions into a brokerage account, into an IRA, into something that is invested in the market, you are going to see the growth that is going to be required to really retire and have a very happy and healthy retirement. All right, guys, so that is going to do it. Really some mind-blowing stats out here. When you think of everybody that is, accumulating money, not having enough money in savings accounts because we know things are super expensive, but then the people that do have money, they're not keeping it properly. They're not storing it in those high yield savings accounts. They're just kind of sitting on it. And of course, when you look at the disparity between the richest Americans and then, of course, the upper middle class, they are about 5 times as more likely to have that. Make sure that you check your bank account. It is up to you. And I really do challenge you with this. It is up to you to understand and know your own personal finances. For a majority of people, nobody else is going to look at it. Nobody else is going to monitor it. Even when you look at where your 401k is invested in, your IRA money, your HSA money, you have to know what you're getting into, what you're dealing with, and how you're investing your money. So again, that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think, and I'll catch you in the next video. When it comes to building wealth, the stock market is the number one place. Not gold, not bonds, not real estate. Even though one asset class might outperform in the short term, when it comes to long-term wealth generation and really building a portfolio, stocks are the way to go. Now, data from the Dutch Bank shows over the past 100 years, equities beat out gold by 5.6%, housing prices by 6.6%, treasuries by 6.8%, oil by 8.4%, per year over the past 100 years, making the stock market the best place. Now, in today's video, we're going to be breaking down my 3 favorite and very popular ETFs, the VOO, the QQQM, and the SCHD. Now, all 3 of these are really easy to invest in, and in a portfolio, which one is the best one and which one should you be buying right now? we're going to get into it. So the first one on our list is the VOO, or the Vanguard S&P 500. Now this is the best and the easiest. When you think of the greats like Warren Buffett, everyone should own a piece of the VOO. When you think of the market itself, it is about 80% of the entire stock market. It covers every industry, it covers every sector, and most investors don't beat the market itself. When you start thinking of investors, almost 90% of investment advisors cannot beat the S&P 500. And this benchmark is kind of crazy to think. It contains the 500 largest companies in the United States. Actually, it's 503 because some stocks have two class of stocks in there. When it goes to the portfolio, the VOO this year has been over 30%, which is kind of incredible. In the past 12 months, over a 30% return. And when you start thinking about the index's historical returns, it's about 10.5%. Now, you don't get it over every year, but in the long term, it has been remarkably consistent when it comes to the returns. Even looking at the VOO as guaranteed returns or generated returns of 271% or 14% annually over the past 10 years, which is kind of crazy. Even so far this year, we're seeing it up about 22. In the last 12 months, we're seeing it up over 30%. We know this is not going to go on forever. When it comes to the Vanguard ETF, and of course, I do hold this one personally in my investment portfolio with a index fee, a low expense ratio of a 0.03, which is kind of crazy. Virtually all of the money that you put into this is going and really working incredibly well for you. Now, of course, when it comes to index investing, analysts believes that it is poised for a little bit of a downturn next year, but nobody knows. It's really a question mark. They say that we could see a pullback in the VOO, or the S&P 500, of roughly 20 to 25%. When you start looking at a multitude of years, if I'm investing at that 20-25% reduction next year, I am buying it at a 20 to 25% discount, which is exactly what we want. I want it discounted. I want it to go down because I'm not close to retirement and I'm still putting money regularly into the VOO. Now, the second one we're looking at in the Investco Trust Series, the one ETF is the QQQ. Now, of course, there are two variations of this, the QQQ, and there is also a QQQM. Now, the QQQM is the same, essentially following the NASDAQ 100, but it does come with a little bit less liquidity, but it also comes with a little bit of a lower fee, which is the one that I do love to use. Now, when you start thinking about the QQQ, if you caught any of the very snazzy commercials they got, it tracks the performance of the NASDAQ 100 index instead of that S&P 500 index like we see with the VOO. Tech stocks, of course, have been leading the market to new highs, really driven when you think of Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia. They have been doing incredibly well. Even looking at the past decade, it has generated total returns of 473%, which is insane over the last 10 years. But of course, like I said, this is very tech heavy. Now, this is driven almost its entirety by two big things. Number one being the semiconductors, and really how many and how big the demand is for those semiconductors. The second one is artificial intelligence. So if you're thinking in the future, we're going to have, of course, in my opinion, we're going to see a lot more that is coming out of semiconductors, much more of a demand for computing power, and much more demand and integration with artificial intelligence in a lot of different places, which means the future, there's going to be two types of companies. This is a quote I heard. There's going to be companies that embrace and utilize AI, and there's going to be companies that did not embrace AI and no longer exist. Might be a fact in the next 5 to 10 years that some of the companies that don't find the efficiency with artificial intelligence are no longer really going to exist. Now, when it comes to corporate spending, a lot of businesses paused the spending because their rates were so high, it was expensive to borrow money. The Fed raised it by, or lowered rates by 50 basis points, which means money does come a little bit cheaper. If they continue into 2025 to reduce rates, we're going to see money get cheaper, meaning that institutions can borrow a lot more. And the final one, which is one of my favorites, when it comes to one that I love, it is the Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, the SCHD. Now, all three of these, the VOO, the QQQ, and the SCHD, I do hold in my 3 ETF portfolio, which I absolutely recommend. It has been doing incredible in the last 3 years, just north of 3 years. We're up about 84% in totality, which is crazy through dollar cost averaging. And like I said before, even when the stock market goes down, if we see a pullback or a reduction in the value of the stock market, that is a great time to buy. You don't want to be selling when the numbers are really going up, when we see it running, when we're seeing record highs. Even this year, I believe I read earlier today, we have seen 47 record highs this year from the S&P 500, which is kind of crazy. But looking at the SCHD, this is very different. So the VOO was a big encompassing 503 stocks within the stock market, largest companies. When you started looking at that QQQ, it was the NASDAQ 100, very heavily focused in the tech side. This is the dividend side. So you are getting pretty much the three best, which I know there is some overlap. People always talk about this all the time. There is some overlap, but there's a point where one, you want a fundamental ETF, which is going to be your basis. It's going to be the core, which is that VOO. Now, of course, you can use a bunch of different variations that track the S&P 500. Doesn't really make a big difference which one you're using, but personally, I use the VOO. The second one being that QQQ. And of course, that tracks and really is the growth factor for it. When you start looking at how well the VOO performed in relationship to the QQQM with the tech-driven heavy has done incredibly well. And then, of course, like I said, the SCHD is the third one we're looking at. When you start looking at long-term wealth, the buying dividend stocks, growth stocks, is really putting any strategy on steroids. Reinvested dividends account for 85% of the S&P 500's total return since 1960. Let me read that one more time from here. Reinvested dividends account for 85% of the S&P 500's total return since 1960, which is insane. Moreover, the best performing stocks in the index go back to the 1930s, which have initially and given dividends and raised the payouts through time. They have never had a losing decade. So kind of crazy. When we think of the SCHD, that is why so many people do recommend it. One of the best investment vehicles to income generation. And of course, it consists of 100 dividend paying stocks and yields a 3.4% return. Now, the unique thing with this one is even though it is an ETF, even though it is poised as a dividend ETF, we are still seeing a tremendous amount of value out of the companies, which is the reason why, even though there's a 3.4% yield on this specific ETF, we have also seen about an 11% growth, which is exceptional. Now, it was created in 2011, established a really good track record right off the gate, nearly 11% annually over the past 10 years, which is crazy. Just recently increased its dividend by 15%, and it had a 3-to-1 stock split. Now, of course, for all three of these, like I said earlier, I am invested in these with a portfolio of, I think it's around $130,000 as it sits right now. If you look at some of the older videos where we hit the milestone of 100,000, it has grown exponentially and continues to grow this year. So guys, out of all three, what is the best ETF? Which one should you buy today? My opinion, all three. Now, I know that that's kind of a bias. Now, when you start breaking apart this and kind of how it should be bought and how you should kind of put it together, if you're in the younger generation, so we're talking 20s and 30s, a lot more heavy into the QQQ, a lot more into the stock, or excuse me, the ETFs that we have in there, focusing on the tech because you have, another 30, 40 years until you're getting ready to retire. If you're mid, so thinking 30s and 40s, a little bit less in the QQQ. So even thinking now, having about 35% in that QQQ, remaining percentages split between the VOO and the SCHD. And what I'm systematically doing with my plan is as I slowly move out of my position of the heavy tech QQQM, as I get closer to retirement, I am putting more into the SCHD. Now with the VOO, because that is the basis, that is the foundation ETF that I do carry, I'm going to keep that one at my 30%. The SCHD will essentially, as I get closer to retirement, take the place of the QQQM, not in its entirety. Now remember, if you're thinking of a target age of 65 for retirement, that does not mean, number one, you hit the age of 65, you're cashing all of your funds out, that's it, you're done investing. You still need growth out of this thing. When you start retiring at 65, you roughly have estimated 25 years of life left, meaning keeping some in the QQQ, keeping some in the SCHD with a little bit of a different variation on the percentages that you have in there, but you still want to see growth out of those tech. You still want to see essentially a growth factor in there. Not only the dividends that you're getting out of some of these, but you want to make sure that it's growing even through retirement. So all right, guys, so that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. And as always, Thank you guys for watching. Everybody's been looking for a way to make passive income. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at 3 ETFs really to maximize your portfolio income. When you start getting closer to retirement, this can make a big difference because maximizing the portfolio income or the generation that you can get through dividends can supplement Social Security. For a lot of people, it does work incredibly well. Now, when we start thinking about dividend stocks or dividend ETFs, they have a lot of different benefits in addition to providing a very steady stream of completely passive income. You put money in, you get income back out of those, but you can also reinvest this. And that's kind of the process that I want to talk about today. Not only the 3 ETFs that we're going to break down, but when it comes to the dividend and the reinvesting of the dividends, this is the point that you really get the snowball effect. So when we think of something like an ETF like the SCHD, it is really a very high dividend yield overall for an ETF, but we also see a lot of value in that ETF. We also see a lot of growth in that ETF, which really is a signal that companies have strong stability, that they're going to be around for a while. And we've also seen really dividend appreciation or the increase in dividends in the last couple years. So when we start thinking of selecting personal dividend stocks, just picking one single stock in the entirety, I do not recommend at all. That is the reason why I stick to ETFs and ETFs in their entirety. When you look at one individual stock, it could be a bad news that, of course, sends the stock down. Even though the dividend will still be there for that stock, sometimes they can pull the dividend. And if they do, guess what? You're kind of out, because if you own that stock, the stock declines. That is where the ETFs come in. And that is the reason why, personally, I only invest in ETFs and ETFs in their entirety. It's a great way to generate income over an extended amount of time. Now, the 3 that we're going to look at, the first one, which is one that I hold more than any else. If you guys remember my YouTube AdSense, all of the money, literally 100% of the AdSense revenue that we're getting from YouTube is going into the SCHD, the all-around dividend strength stock. We've seen it split at a 3-to-1 split. So if you're looking to invest it, in my opinion, it is a really good time because not so heavy into the tech side like we see with some of the very strong, like the QQQ, but it still does incredibly well when it comes to the value and the growth that we've seen, as well as the return. Very well-rounded, competitively priced. It targets a portfolio around 100 stocks. When you think of investing into one single stock, I do not recommend it. When you look at investing in 100 large cap companies, it makes a big difference. Now, it has an amazing track record of paying out dividends. Also, the yield plus the dividend growth. When you're compounding the growth that you're getting from dividends in there, it can really make it and drive this one really to the top. More than 63 billion in assets under management, one monthly trading average of about 11 million. SCHD has a very good liquidity position, but also yields a 3.4 as it sits right now with the dividend yield. Now, the second one we look at is one of my second favorites, which is the VYM. Now, this again is another dividend and value stock ETF that I do carry in a portfolio. This is actually in my kids' portfolio. So very like the SCHD, this one is the VYM, focuses on those large US cap companies, but it has a different size of the portfolio with more than 5 times the holding. So when you think of the SCHD, we're holding 100 stocks. The VYM holds over 500 stocks in this portfolio. So when you think of this ETF, it is instant diversification just based on the portfolio that they have. When you start looking bigger picture, you're talking about large cap, dividend paying companies, high stability, and also an excellent choice when it comes to diversification because of the 500 companies that it does hold. Now, the final one we're going to look at in the third one is the VIG. Now, this one is another Vanguard, but this is the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. So a slight of a different focus than what we see with the VIM. Rather than targeting stocks that have the value proposition, the VIG only looks at future growth and only looks at dividend growth. So it's a lot more focused on the dividend and that generation, meaning there might be companies that are in the other portfolio of the VYM that does not get and are not included in the VIG because of the portfolio that they're doing and really the metrics that they're building this ETF. Now, specifically with the VIG, companies must have at least 10 years. So we are talking a generation of annual dividend increases. If there's a reduction, they are out. If the dividends stop, they are completely out. 10 years of consecutive dividend increase. So of course, this one, the VIG portfolio is about 340 stocks, well diversified, but not quite as broad as the VYM. So when we think of the VYM in comparison to the VIG, you can see the difference in there with the amount that they hold. So essentially, if you have 500 in the VYM, 340 in the VIG, some of those 500 companies that are held in that VYM are not included and do not meet the criteria of the 10 years of consecutive payouts, which is the reason why they do exclude them. So when we think of dividend ETFs, and this is a question that I get all of the time, when you start looking at dividend ETFs, there are a ton of them. There's a bunch of different ways. There's a bunch of different options. There's a lot of different things that they do, from calls and puts and dividend generation. These funds have a really good, strong, really different strategy, but there can be very broad-based or a little bit more pigeonholed. Almost when we think of the SCHD, it really focuses on the dividend yield, holding 100. When we think of some of the other ones, holding up to 500, I mean, a 5x amount with the holding is incredible. Now, the other thing to remember is with these ETFs, they have a very low expense ratio. That is one of the really big things. When you start breaking out the expense ratio, the higher it is, the more you're going to be paying for the fund. That fund better be returning a very high yield or a very high growth rate to really the justification of buying these ETFs. Now, of course, a lot of these ETFs do come in a variety of the mutual funds. So more of the managed mutual funds that are just not essentially building and tracking a specific portfolio, which when we start getting into mutual funds versus ETFs, mutual funds do come with a management fee. That is the reason why, again, I focus in ETFs on their entirety. Now, when we start thinking and talking about the really passive income, the wealth generation, this is the part that I really do want to break down. So what I've done and what I've really built, and of course, let me know your comments down below what you guys think, is we do a 3 ETF portfolio, which I've actually adjusted. Got a video coming pretty soon for that. But the 3 ETF portfolio really focuses on a foundational or a fundamental ETF. For me, that is the VOO, but it could be the SPDR, the SPY, could be a bunch of them. Different companies offer something that tracks the S&P 500, which is going to be the foundational ETF that you have in that portfolio. Depending on your age, we have a very heavy tech side. So when you think of the VUG, when you think of the QQQ, when you think of something that is very heavily invested into AI technology, into the semiconductors, these mega cap companies that are really driven by artificial intelligence, and of course, the tech sector itself, you want to make sure that you are holding some of this. I know a lot of people, it's a little bit more of a risk, but a bigger return. When you look at what some of the QQQM has done in relationship to the VOO, you can see the difference where the risk comes from over the last decade and where we're seeing the growth factor. And the final piece of that 3 ETF is the dividend side. So of course, when we start thinking of the portfolio, when you start thinking about the return that you're getting from these dividends, my dividends are reinvested. So when I'm getting them from all 3 of the ETFs I hold in that portfolio, it is automatically reinvesting in that portfolio. So what I've done though is as we get closer to retirement, we have actually moved a couple more percentage into something that is more of the dividend, something more of the dividend yielding and the income generation versus holding it all into the heavy tech stock, because of course, high volatility, high risk when it comes to a lot of the tech ETFs. And if we see a downturn next year, which who knows what the future is going to bring, but we do have some that is in that income generation bucket that is going to continue to yield a pretty good return, which of course is going to build the portfolio when you start thinking big picture on the generation of not only holding more shares of the dividend ETF and more shares of the QQQ and the VOO, we can continue to reinvest those dividends every quarter, making it and building this portfolio bigger. And I also do DCA or dollar cost averaging. So we're putting a set amount every 2 weeks into this portfolio as well, which again can make it grow exponentially faster. So you can see kind of how this snowball follows. And if you've been following my channel for a while, we did the 3 ETF portfolio. We started right around, I believe it was around 70,000. Right now that portfolio is $130,000 plus. So it's been proven, it works incredibly well. We continue making regular contributions, and even thinking of the last 3 years, we have seen about an 85% return in that portfolio, which is just phenomenal. But all right, guys, so that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know what you think about the income generation and the dividend ETFs. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Are you looking to double your money? Even with higher interest rates that we've seen, CDs, savings accounts are simply not the way that it's going to happen. when we start looking at doubling, tripling the money that you have, it is often taking some risk that is associated with that double. Now, really to achieve this level of return, there's a couple different options which do come with some risk that we're going to be talking about in this video. I'm going to be looking at 5 ways to double your money from honestly the least riskiest that we do have up until the very high risk. And of course, with more risk, you can have a shorter runway to doubling your money. Now, the first one we look at is getting a 401k match. This is super simple, super basic. When you think of a 401k match, if I'm putting in 5%, my employer puts in 5%, guess what? You just doubled your money right there. Very low risk, very easy to do if your company offers a 401k match. And of course, those contributions can grow, meaning that as you're doubling your money every single paycheck with the employer match, this can be a game changer for a majority of individuals. However, not everybody puts into the 401k plan. Not everybody looks for the match, meaning that you are losing out in money for your entirety. And it's kind of crazy. Now, one of the downsides with this that you could see is some companies do have a certain amount of time that you have to be employed with them. My employer, it was 3 years before you were actually vested to get the money that your employer put in there. And of course, what investments do you have access to? But even getting a 401k plan, getting double that 5%, you, regardless of the investment, really putting it in target date funds, putting it in an S&P 500, almost anything that you put it in, you're not going to lose 50% of the value because they are managed plans and they are usually brokered or really provided from your company. Now, of course, 401k plans, you got to know the ins and outs, but doubling your money instantly is very easy. Now, the second one that I look at, which again, 401k plans, I am looking at. Second one, investing in the S&P 500, which I do in my portfolio and I do on a very regular basis. Now, when it comes to CDs, when it comes to bonds, the returns are never going to be there. When you start looking into individual stocks, I do not buy individual stocks at all. I only buy ETFs, which I have a lot invested in the QQQM, also the S&P 500 and the HD. And of course, looking at a very strong option in a longevity option, it has very attractive long-term returns. When you start looking at roughly 10% return from the S&P 500 over an extended amount of time, you can double your money in roughly 7 years. If you think about that runway, so if you're 25 right now, 7 years later, you're doubling your money. 7 years later from there, you're doubling your money. That doesn't include any of the contributions that you're adding to that. That is just doubling the contributions that you already have based on the growth factor, based on the compounding factor, which can make a really big difference. Now, of course, when we start looking big picture, negative returns, which were during the 2000s, when we see the S&P 500 down, made up for it in the 2010 era, when we see the S&P 500 up 252%, tripling and more than tripling the money that you had in there. Now, S&P 500, I have a link down below for M1 Finance. Super easy to invest in. Literally, it is something you can invest and really set it and forget it, not even have to worry about it again. But before we get into our next one, please subscribe to the video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. And looking at our third one, buying a home. Real estate doesn't seem like a very good way to double your money very quickly. But again, thinking of the risk associated with it, it is slow, steady gains. There hasn't been a point in my life that since I purchased a house 11 years ago, I have already seen my home itself within that 11 years over double in price from where we purchased it. And of course, it could lead to the homes doubling in value, which is what we've traditionally seen. Now, when it comes to a mortgage, it relies on the power of leverage and utilizing the money, not owing the money within there to really get the value. If you buy a $200,000 home, you put your 20% down, which is pretty typical nowadays. So that $40,000, you already have built-in equity, which I do not recommend people tapping into the equity, which a lot of people do doing home equities, things of that nature. In my opinion, it turns your home into more of a liability and a risk of possibly losing that. But when you start looking at the growth factor or the exponential value of the home that is growing, it has went up and almost doubled in the last 10 years. Now, of course, unlike other investments, you have to put more money in the house for maintenance. You have to do, keeping up with repairs, new HVAC, new windows, new roofs, all of that while continuing to pay down the mortgage. But of course, if you didn't have the home, if you weren't paying a mortgage, you would have to pay rent or you'd have to have something. That, of course, is the upside and the downside of owning a home. Now, looking at number 4, this is where we start getting into a high risk trading cryptocurrency. Now, when it comes to cryptocurrency, we are talking Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin. There's a big opportunity for speculation. There's a big opportunity for making money. Honestly, there's also a very big downside. There's a big possibility for losing a ton of money. And we know with the volatility of crypto, you might see, Bitcoin at 60,000 one day, 68 a week later, 62, a week after that, 54, 30. Guys, it's all over the place. If you're playing the game of trading cryptocurrency versus the buy and hold strategy, you can really soar in a couple of years if you're good at it. The bounce is significant enough that you can make some real money versus the buy and hold, and really you don't want to lose money anywhere, but especially in cryptocurrency because it can be very, very volatile. And the last one we look at, which is the most volatility we see, trading options. Now, me personally, I've seen like the Jeppy that trades options, a couple different places. You can lose money, you can double your money, or you can lose all your money. Options can be very lucrative and they are very, very high risk. And it's crazy because even looking at this article from MSN.com, they put trading options as far more riskier than trading cryptocurrency, which again is kind of interesting, has very big upsides, very big downsides. A call option gives you a right, but not the obligation to purchase stock at a specific price. And of course, a put option gives you the right, but not the obligation to sell at a specific time. So there is a lot that goes into this. Do your research when you think of really playing the speculation in the market with if stocks are going to go up and down. That is what you're playing with, and you can actually do this. And a lot of people play this and play this game very well, but a lot of them do it on margin, meaning not only could you lose your money, you could lose 10x your money if you're borrowing money that is already kind of out there. Now, it's kind of crazy to think that they give access in this much kind of leverage to people to buy, but they do. I've seen it in the crypto space where they give you a 10x leverage. I've even seen it through like a KuCoin where you can get up to 100x leverage on cryptocurrency, which again is kind of crazy to think that they give you access to that much money. So how soon can you double your money? That is the big question. This is where the rule of 72 comes in. Now, if you heard this, it is a very simple trick mathematically to quickly estimate when you're going to double your money. It's called the rule of 72, like I said, and the principle is very simple. Divide 72 by your expected return. That is when it is going to double. For example, if you earn an 8% annual return, it will take about 9 years for that rule of 72 to double your money. When we start thinking of that S&P 500, 10% return, so just a 2% more return, the rule of 72 goes to about 7 years before your money will double. And again, you can start really snowballing the investment, start snowballing the strategy, depending on how much you're earning from that return. But remember, the rule of 72 is a very big estimation, meaning that, the rate might not be 8% annually every single year for those 9 years to double that return. Just like the S&P 500 this year, we're seeing up about 22%, where in 2022 it was down 22%. So again, you have to take that with a grain of salt and knowing what your average return is to use the rule of 72 and knowing exactly where you're at. So the bottom line, if you're looking to double your money in a reasonable time frame, which again is about 7 to 10 years, if you can double your money every 7 to 10 years, it's going to be a game changer for your finances, building wealth, building generational wealth, unless you want to do it much faster like cryptocurrency or doing option trading, which again, do your research. You don't want it to be more like gambling than investing when it comes to that. You can build your fortune, but you don't and can wipe it out easy without knowing exactly what you're doing. Thinking of things, eliminating the risks, such as the 401k match, the S&P 500, or even owning a home can make a big difference. All right, guys, so that is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. And as always, thank you guys for watching.